The crisp October morning air carried the scent of fallen leaves as Sarah walked through the sprawling estate sale in Rhinebeck. New York. The Victorian mansion, built during the Gilded Age, was being emptied after its elderly owner had passed away with no surviving relatives. Tables, laden with antiques, artwork, and personal belongings, covered the expansive front lawn, attracting collectors and curious locals from throughout the Hudson Valley. Sarah, a freelance photographer and antique enthusiast, had driven up from Manhattan specifically for this sale. She had heard rumors that the estate contained an exceptional collection of early American photography, and as someone who specialized in restoring historical images, she was always searching for unique pieces that might contain forgotten stories. The mansion itself was a testament to turn-of-the-century wealth, with its ornate gingerbread trim, wraparound porches, and towering turrets that commanded spectacular views of the Hudson River. The current owner, Mrs. Elizabeth Fairmont, had been a reclusive widow who had lived alone in the house for nearly 40 years, rarely entertaining visitors and keeping to herself. Among the numerous photo albums and loose pictures scattered across several tables, one particular image caught Sarah's attention. It was a large, beautifully preserved album in print mounted on thick cardboard backing, kind of formal photograph that would have been quite expensive in 1902. The image radiated pure happiness and captured a perfect moment of American leisure. During the Roosevelt era, the photograph showed a delightful summer picnic scene beside a pristine lake, surrounded by towering pine trees and rolling hills. In the foreground, a group of elegantly dressed families had spread colorful blankets on the grass. Women in white cotton dresses and elaborate hats sat gracefully beside wicker picnic baskets, while men in light summer suits and straw boater hats lounged nearby. Children in sailor suits and ruffled dresses played games on the grass, their faces bright with laughter. The composition was masterful, clearly the work of a skilled photographer who understood how to capture both the natural beauty of the landscape and the joy of human interaction. The lake in the background sparkled in the summer sunlight, its surface appearing calm and inviting. Everything about the scene spoke of prosperity, leisure, and the simple pleasures of family life. A handwritten note on the back of the photograph, in faded brown ink, read, "Sacandaga Lake Summer Picnic, July 4th, 1902. The Morrison and Whitley families celebrating Independence Day." The notation was signed with the initials J.M. Sarah purchased the photograph for $25, drawn to its exceptional quality and the story it seemed to tell about American life at the dawn of the 20th century. Back in her Brooklyn studio apartment, Sarah carefully placed the 1902 photograph on her professional scanner. As a restoration specialist, she had learned that high-resolution digital scans often reveal details invisible to the naked eye, details that could provide valuable historical context or uncover previously unknown aspects of old photographs. The scanning process took several minutes, as Sarah set the resolution to capture every minute detail of the albumen print. When the image appeared on her computer screen, she was struck once again by the photograph's exceptional clarity and composition. The photographer had clearly been skilled in his craft, managing to capture sharp detail from the foreground figures all the way to the distant shoreline. Sarah began her usual systematic examination of the image, zooming in on different sections to assess the photograph's condition and historical value. She studied the clothing styles, noting how they perfectly reflected 1902 fashion trends. The women's white cotton dresses with their high necklines and long sleeves were typical of summer wear for respectable ladies, while their elaborate hats, decorated with flowers and ribbons, showed the influence of European millinery styles. The men's attire was equally authentic to the period, lightweight suits in pale colors, starched white collars, and the straw boater hats that had become emblematic of American summer leisure. The children's clothing reflected the era's belief in dressing youngsters as miniature adults, with the boys in sailor suits and the girls in frilly dresses that mirrored their mothers' styles. The picnic itself appeared lavish, with multiple wicker baskets, fine china plates, and crystal glasses that caught the sunlight. This was clearly not a simple family outing, but an elaborate social gathering that would have required considerable planning and expense. Sarah then turned her attention to the background elements, the landscape that provided such a beautiful setting for the human drama in the foreground. The lake stretched into the distance, bordered by dense forests of pine and oak trees. The water appeared crystal clear and inviting, reflecting the summer sky and surrounding vegetation. As she zoomed in on the far shore of the lake, examining the tree line and distant hills, Sarah's cursor moved across the water's surface. At maximum magnification, focused on an area of the lake perhaps 200 yards from the picnic site, something made her pause. There, barely visible even at high magnification, floating motionless near the center of the lake, was what appeared to be a pale object that seemed distinctly different from the natural elements surrounding it. At first glance, it might have been dismissed as a piece of driftwood or perhaps a dead fish, but as Sarah adjusted the contrast and brightness, the horrible truth became unmistakably clear. It was a human body, floating face down in the pristine lake waters, completely unnoticed by the joyful families celebrating Independence Day on the distant shore. Sarah stared at her computer screen in shock, her hands trembling as she zoomed in and out of the disturbing image. The contrast between the cheerful picnic in the foreground and the floating corpse in the background was deeply unsettling. She spent the next hour adjusting various digital enhancement settings, hoping she might be mistaken. But each manipulation of the image only confirmed what she had discovered. The body appeared to be that of an adult, though it was impossible to determine gender or age from the distant, grainy image. What was clear was that it had been in the water for some time. The positioning and pale coloration suggested decomposition had begun. Most disturbing of all was the obvious fact that none of the picnickers seemed aware of the tragedy unfolding in the lake behind them. Sarah's first instinct was to contact local authorities, but she quickly realized that any crime had occurred over 120 years ago. Instead, she decided to research the photograph's origins and try to understand what had happened at Sacandaga Lake on July 4th, 1902. Her initial internet searches revealed that Sacandaga Lake was located in the Adirondack region of upstate New York, an area that had become increasingly popular with wealthy city dwellers during the late 1800s and early 1900s. The region was known for its pristine wilderness, excellent fishing, and elaborate great camps where wealthy families would spend their summers escaping the heat and crowds of cities like New York and Albany. But the Morrison and Whitley families mentioned in the photograph's notation were not immediately familiar to Sarah, but she suspected they might have been among the wealthy families who maintained summer residences in the Adirondacks. She began searching historical records, newspaper archives, and genealogical databases for any information about these families and their connection to the Sacandaga Lake area. Her breakthrough came when she discovered that the New York State Archives contained extensive records related to the Adirondack region's development as a summer resort destination. The archives included newspaper clippings, business records, and even some personal correspondence from families who had built camps in the area. After several hours of research, Sarah found a reference to the Morrison family in a 1901 issue of the Albany Evening Journal. According to the article, Thomas Morrison was a successful lumber baron who had built an elaborate summer camp on the shores of Sacandaga Lake. The camp, described as a rustic palace, featured multiple buildings including a main lodge, guest cottages, and extensive recreational facilities. The Whitley family proved more elusive, but Sarah eventually found them mentioned in the social pages of several New York newspapers. James Whitley appeared to be a prominent banker who had business connections with Morrison and had been invited to join the Lumbers. Barron's exclusive summer social circle, Sarah, printed out everything she could find and spread the documents across her kitchen table, trying to piece together the social dynamics of this wealthy summer community. But she still had no information about what might have caused someone to end up dead in the lake during what should have been a joyful Independence Day celebration. Sarah's research took a crucial turn when she decided to search newspaper archives from July 1902, looking specifically for any reports of accidents, disappearances, or other unusual incidents around Sacandaga Lake during the Independence Day period. Her persistence paid off when she discovered a small item buried in the back pages of the July 8, 1902 edition of the Gloversville Morning Herald. The brief article, titled "Summer Visitor Missing from Adirondack Resort," reported that a young man named William Chen had disappeared from the Morrison family's summer camp sometime during the July 4th holiday weekend. According to the report, Chen was described as a 28-year-old artist from New York City who had been invited to spend the summer at the camp to paint landscape scenes of the Adirondack wilderness. The article stated that Chen had last been seen on the evening of July 3rd, when he had mentioned to other guests his intention to take an early morning walk around the lake to scout potential painting locations. When he failed to appear for the Independence Day festivities the following day, the other guests initially assumed he had become absorbed in his work and lost track of time, apparently a common occurrence with the artistic young man. However, when Chen still hadn't returned by evening, Thomas Morrison had organized search parties to look for him around the lake and surrounding forests. The searches had continued for 3 days, but had found no trace of the missing artist. Local authorities had been notified, but the article suggested that the investigation had been limited and inconclusive. What struck Sarah as particularly significant was the timing. Chen had disappeared sometime between the evening of July 3rd and the morning of July 4th, exactly when the picnic photograph had been taken. If the body in the lake was indeed William Chen, it meant he had been floating there, unnoticed, while the families celebrated just a few hundred yards away. Sarah found additional information about Chen in New York City art journals and exhibition catalogs from the early 1900s. He had been a promising young artist, recently graduated from the National Academy of Design, who specialized in landscape painting, and had been gaining recognition for his work depicting American wilderness scenes. Several art critics had praised Chen's ability to capture the subtle interplay of light and shadow in natural settings, and he had been commissioned by wealthy patrons to create paintings of their country estates and summer retreats. His invitation to the Morrison camp had apparently been part of a commission to create a series of paintings featuring the beauty of the Adirondack region. The more Sarah learned about William Chen, the more the tragedy of his death affected her. He had been a talented young man with a promising future, whose life had been cut short in circumstances that remained mysterious. The fact that his body had apparently floated unnoticed in the lake while others celebrated nearby added a particularly macabre element to the story. But Sarah still had many unanswered questions. How had Chen ended up in the lake? Had his death been an accident, or something more sinister? And why had the search parties failed to find his body when it was apparently floating in plain sight? Determined to learn more about William Chen's disappearance, Sarah decided to travel to the Adirondack region to conduct on-site research. The drive from Brooklyn to the Sacandaga Lake area took her through some of New York State's most beautiful countryside, and as she wound through the mountain roads, she could understand why wealthy families had been drawn to build their summer retreats in this pristine wilderness. Her first stop was the Adirondack Museum at Blue Mountain Lake, which housed extensive collections related to the region's history as a summer playground for America's wealthy elite. The museum's research library contained detailed records about the various great camps that had been built around the turn of the century, including information about the Morrison family's elaborate retreat. The museum's curator, Dr. Patricia Williams, was fascinated by Sarah's discovery and immediately grasped its historical significance. The great camps were closed communities, Dr. Williams explained as they examined historical photographs and documents. These wealthy families created their own social worlds in the wilderness, often with little oversight from local authorities. If something happened at one of these camps, it could easily be covered up or overlooked. Dr. Williams showed Sarah detailed maps of the Sacandaga Lake area from 1902, pointing out the location of the Morrison camp and the various guest cottages and recreational facilities. The camp had been truly impressive, covering over 300 acres and featuring multiple buildings designed to blend with the natural environment while providing every luxury expected by wealthy summer visitors. The records revealed that Thomas Morrison had spared no expense in creating his wilderness retreat. The main lodge alone had cost over $50,000 to build, an enormous sum in 1902, and featured rustic log construction combined with elegant interior furnishings imported from Europe. The camp also included a private dock, boathouse, tennis court, and extensive hiking trails throughout the property. Sarah learned that the Morrison camp had been designed to accommodate up to 20 guests at a time, and during the summer of 1902, it had hosted a rotating group of Morrison's business associates, their families, and various artists and intellectuals who were invited to enjoy the wilderness setting. William Chen had been part of this carefully curated social circle, invited specifically because of his artistic talents and his ability to capture the natural beauty that Morrison wanted to preserve in paintings. Dr. Williams also provided Sarah with contact information for the local historical society, and suggested she speak with longtime residents who might have family stories about the old camps and any unusual incidents that might have occurred there. As Sarah drove toward the actual site of the former Morrison camp, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was getting closer to understanding what had really happened to William Chen on that July 4th weekend in 1902. The beautiful landscape around her seemed peaceful and inviting, but she now knew it had witnessed a tragedy that had been hidden for over a century. Sarah's visit to the Sacandaga Lake Historical Society proved to be a goldmine of information. The society was housed in a converted 19th century schoolhouse and was run by a dedicated group of local volunteers who had spent decades collecting stories, photographs, and documents related to the area's history. The society's president, Eleanor Hutchins, was a lifelong resident whose family had lived in the area since before the great camps were built. Her great-grandfather had worked as a guide for the wealthy summer visitors, and family stories had been passed down through the generations about the sometimes eccentric behavior of the city folk who came to rough it in the wilderness. Morrison Camp was always a little different from the others, Eleanor explained as she and Sarah examined historical photographs and maps. Thomas Morrison was known for being very controlling about what happened on his property. He didn't like having local law enforcement involved in camp business, and he had enough money and influence to pretty much do things his own way. Eleanor shared a family story that had been passed down from her great-grandfather. During the summer of 1902, there had been some kind of trouble at the Morrison camp around the 4th of July, but the details had been kept very quiet. Her great-grandfather had been asked to help with search parties looking for a missing guest, but after a few days, he had been told that his services were no longer needed and that the matter had been resolved. My great-grandfather always said there was something fishy about the whole thing, Eleanor continued. He knew those woods and that lake better than anyone, and he couldn't understand how someone could just disappear without a trace. But Morrison paid him well for his silence, and jobs were hard to come by in those days. Sarah showed Eleanor the enhanced photograph on her laptop, pointing out the barely visible body floating in the lake. Eleanor studied the image carefully, her expression growing more serious as she grasped the implications of Sarah's discovery. "This explains a lot," Eleanor said quietly. "There were always rumors that something had happened at the Morrison camp that summer, but no one ever had any proof. My family always wondered what had really become of that young artist who was supposed to be staying there." Eleanor then shared another crucial piece of information. Her family had maintained records of all the people who had worked as guides, boat operators and general laborers for the various camps over the years. These records included detailed notes about which guests were staying at which camps and when, information that had been important for coordinating services and supplies. According to these records, William Chen had indeed been staying at the Morrison camp during early July 1902, and he had been scheduled to remain there through the end of the month to complete his painting commission. However, the records showed that on July 5th, the day after the Independence Day picnic, Morrison had abruptly canceled all of Chen's scheduled guide services and had informed the local suppliers that the artist would no longer be requiring provisions or assistance. The timing was suspicious. Chen had supposedly disappeared during the night of July 3rd. Yet Morrison hadn't canceled his services until July 5th, after the picnic had taken place. This suggested that Morrison might have known Chen was dead even while the photograph was being taken. Sarah's investigation took on new urgency as she delved deeper into William Chen's final days at the Morrison camp. Through Eleanor's connections with local families, she was able to access personal letters and diary entries that had been preserved by descendants of people who had worked at the various camps. During the summer of 1902, one particularly valuable source was the diary of Mary O'Brien, who had worked as a cook at the Morrison camp and had kept detailed records of daily life there. Mary's entries from early July 1902 painted a picture of growing tension between William Chen and some of the other guests at the camp. According to Mary's observations, Chen had been enthusiastic about his painting project when he first arrived. In June, spending long hours outdoors, capturing the natural beauty of the lake and surrounding forests. However, by early July, his behavior had changed significantly. He had become more withdrawn and seemed troubled by something he wasn't willing to discuss openly. Mary's entry for July the 2nd was particularly revealing. Mr. Chen seemed very upset during dinner tonight. He kept looking at Mr. Morrison and Mr. Whitley in a strange way, and when Mrs. Morrison asked him about his painting progress, he gave very short answers. After dinner, I saw him writing furiously in a notebook, and when one of the other guests approached him, he quickly closed it and put it away. The entry for July 3rd, Chen's last known day alive, described an argument that had taken place between Chen and Thomas Morrison after breakfast. Mary wrote, "Mr. Chen requested a private meeting with Mr. Morrison in his study. I could hear their voices through the door, and it was clear they were disagreeing about something important. Mr. Chen's voice was raised, and he used words like dishonest and responsibility. When they came out, both men looked very angry, and Mr. Morrison's face was quite red. Sarah also found correspondence between Chen and his art dealer in New York City, letters that had been preserved in the archives of a Manhattan gallery that had represented him. In a letter dated June 28, 1902, Chen had written enthusiastically about his progress on the Adirondack paintings and had mentioned that he was also working on some sketches that might be of interest to certain authorities in Albany. This cryptic reference intrigued Sarah, and she began to wonder if Chen might have witnessed or discovered something at the Morrison camp that had put him in danger. The combination of Morrison's lumber business, his political connections, and the isolated location of his camp could have provided opportunities for activities that wouldn't withstand public scrutiny. A subsequent letter from Chen to his dealer, dated July 1st, struck a more ominous tone. "I may need to cut my stay here short. I've stumbled upon something that I cannot in good conscience ignore, but I'm not sure how to proceed. The situation is more complicated than I initially realized, and I fear that speaking out might have serious consequences for my career and perhaps my safety." This was the last letter Chen had written, and Sarah realized it might provide crucial evidence about his state of mind and the circumstances leading to his death. Sarah's research into Thomas Morrison's business dealings revealed a complex web of financial arrangements and political connections that helped explain why William Chen might have found himself in mortal danger. During the early 1900s, the Adirondack region was experiencing intense pressure from logging operations, and there were growing conflicts between conservationists who wanted to preserve the wilderness and businessmen who saw the forests as a source of enormous profits. At the New York State Archives in Albany, Sarah found records showing that Morrison's Lumber Company had been involved in several controversial land deals during 1901 and 1902. The company had acquired cutting rights to thousands of acres of pristine forest land, often through arrangements with corrupt state officials who were willing to bend regulations in exchange for substantial bribes. These deals were particularly problematic because much of the land in question was supposed to be protected as part of the newly created Adirondack Forest Preserve. The state constitution had been amended in 1894 to declare that the preserve lands should remain forever wild. But Morrison and other lumber barons had found ways to circumvent these protections through legal loopholes and political corruption. Sarah discovered correspondence between Morrison and several state officials that made clear the illegal nature of these arrangements. In one particularly damaging letter, Morrison had written to a state forestry official, "I trust you will find. The enclosed compensation sufficient to ensure that the environmental surveys of the northern parcels are delayed until after our cutting operations are complete. As we discussed, it is important that no detailed records of these areas exist until we have removed the most valuable timber." The financial stakes were enormous. Morrison's company stood to make millions of dollars from the timber on these protected lands, money that would be lost if the illegal cutting operations were exposed. The profits were shared with a network of corrupt officials who had the power to approve or deny logging permits and environmental protections. Sarah realized that William Chen, with his artist's eye for detail and his habit of exploring remote areas to find painting subjects, might have witnessed evidence of these illegal logging operations. His background as a landscape painter would have made him particularly sensitive to environmental destruction, and his letter suggested that he had indeed discovered something that troubled his conscience. The timing of Chen's disappearance, just days before he was supposed to return to New York City, suggested that Morrison might have learned about Chen's discovery and decided to prevent him from reporting it to authorities. The artist's death would not only silence a dangerous witness, but would also serve as a warning to others who might be tempted to interfere with Morrison's profitable arrangements. Sarah found additional evidence in the form of newspaper articles from late 1902 and early 1903, when several conservation groups had attempted to investigate illegal logging in the Adirondacks. These investigations had been hampered by lack of evidence and witness testimony, with several potential witnesses either disappearing or suddenly refusing to cooperate with investigators. The pattern suggested that Morrison had been willing to use violence and intimidation to protect his business interests, and William Chen had simply been unlucky enough to discover evidence that could have destroyed Morrison's empire and sent him to prison. Sarah's investigation took a chilling turn when she realized that the person who had taken the 1902 picnic photograph, identified in the notation as J.M., might have been aware of the body floating in the lake when the picture was captured. The photographer's positioning and the composition of the shot suggested a level of deliberate framing that went beyond casual snapshot photography. Through genealogical research, Sarah determined that J.M. likely referred to Joseph Morrison, Thomas Morrison's younger brother, who was known to be an accomplished amateur photographer. Joseph had studied photography in Europe and had brought expensive camera equipment to the family's Adirondack camp, where he documented family gatherings and the natural beauty of the wilderness setting. At the George Eastman Museum in Rochester, New York, Sarah found examples of Joseph Morrison's other photographic work, including several albums that had been donated by the family decades earlier. His technical skill was evident in the sharp focus, careful composition, and excellent exposure of his images. He was not someone who would have accidentally captured unwanted elements in his photographs. The 1902 picnic photograph showed clear evidence of careful planning and staging. The family groups were arranged in an aesthetically pleasing composition, the lighting was optimal, and the background elements were thoughtfully included to create a sense of depth and natural beauty. For an experienced photographer like Joseph, Morrison to have missed seeing a floating body in the lake seemed highly unlikely. Sarah's analysis of the photograph's composition revealed something even more disturbing. The camera angle and positioning suggested that the body in the lake would have been clearly visible to the photographer through his viewfinder. The fact that he had proceeded to take the photograph anyway indicated either callous indifference to Chen's death or active participation in covering it up. Further research into Joseph Morrison's background revealed that he had significant financial interests in his brother's lumber business and would have been directly affected by any scandal that might have damaged the company's operations. As a partner in several of Thomas Morrison's ventures, Joseph had every reason to help protect the family's business interests from exposure. Sarah found evidence that Joseph Morrison had been present at the camp during the entire period surrounding Chen's disappearance and had been involved in the search parties organized to look for the missing artist. His insider knowledge of what had really happened to Chen would have made him a valuable ally in any cover-up efforts. The photograph itself might have been taken as a form of psychological warfare, a way of demonstrating the family's confidence that their crime would never be discovered. By capturing an image of normal family life proceeding while Chen's body floated unnoticed in the background, the Morrison brothers were essentially documenting their belief that they were above the law and beyond the reach of justice. The fact that the photograph had been carefully preserved and labeled suggested that it held special significance for the family, possibly serving as a private reminder of their power and the consequences of crossing them. Sarah stared at the enhanced 1902 photograph displayed on her laptop screen, finally understanding the full magnitude of what she had discovered. The image that had initially appeared to capture a moment of pure American joy was actually evidence of murder, corruption, and a cover-up that had succeeded for over 120 years. William Chen's death had been carefully orchestrated and callously concealed by some of New York's most powerful families. The evidence Sarah had assembled painted a clear picture of the events surrounding that Independence Day weekend in 1902. William Chen, a talented young artist hired to paint the natural beauty of the Adirondacks, had discovered evidence of massive illegal logging operations that were destroying the very wilderness he had been commissioned to capture. His conscience had compelled him to speak out, but his honesty had cost him his life. Thomas Morrison, faced with the potential exposure of his lucrative but illegal business dealings, had decided that Chen posed too great a threat to be allowed to return to New York City. The artist had been murdered, probably during the early morning hours of July 4th, and his body had been disposed of in Sacandaga Lake. The elaborate Independence Day picnic had proceeded as planned, with the Morrison and Whitley families celebrating, while Chen's corpse floated unnoticed in the background. Joseph Morrison's photograph had captured this macabre scene, creating an inadvertent record of their crime that would remain hidden until Sarah's digital enhancement revealed the truth over a century later. The subsequent cover-up had involved bribing local officials, intimidating potential witnesses, and creating false stories about Chen's disappearance. While criminal prosecution was obviously impossible after so many years, Sarah felt a deep responsibility to ensure that William Chen's story was finally told and that his memory was properly honored. She compiled all her research into a comprehensive report and contacted the New York State Attorney General's office, which maintained a cold case unit for historical crimes. The Attorney General's office was fascinated by Sarah's discoveries and agreed to conduct an official review of the case. While they couldn't pursue criminal charges, they were able to formally acknowledge that William Chen had been the victim of murder and corruption, providing a measure of official recognition that had been denied to him for over a century. Sarah also worked with the Adirondack Museum and the New York State Archives to ensure that the full story was properly documented and preserved for future researchers. The enhanced photograph became part of a permanent exhibition about corruption and environmental destruction in the early Adirondack region. Most importantly, Sarah was able to locate descendants of William Chen's family and share with them the truth about what had happened to their ancestor. Chen's great-nephew, a retired art professor living in California, had always wondered why his great-uncle's promising career had ended so abruptly and mysteriously. Sarah kept a copy of the original photograph, but she could never look at it the same way again. What appeared to be a scene of innocent celebration was actually a moment when evil had triumphed over good, when wealth and power had silenced an honest voice. The floating body in the lake served as a permanent reminder that sometimes the most terrible truths are hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right technology and the right person to bring them into the light. Chen's story proved that while justice might be delayed, the truth has a way of eventually surfacing, no matter how long it remains submerged.